Fishing has always been my life. For as long as I can remember, I've had a rod in my hand and my feet firmly planted in a boat. The calm of the water, the patient wait, the thrill of the tug on the line, all of it gave me purpose. To me, there was nothing like catching the biggest fish of the day and proving that I was the best fisherman in the area. I had been to so many lakes, rivers, and seas that I'd lost count, but each new challenge was a conquest, and I never, ever backed down from a good challenge. So when I heard about the distant lake, the one surrounded by legends and warnings, I knew I had to go. The stories that the biggest fish ever seen lived there, hidden in the depths, only fueled my determination. I knew the lake had a dark name, Black Lake, and that local fishermen avoided it. They said the water hid things best, left undisturbed, and of course, there was always someone willing to talk about the forbidden bait, a lure said to catch something monstrous, but at a price too high to pay. I never needed luck, I thought to myself as I packed my gear. I had heard these legends before, in other places. They were always just stories. But when I stopped to refuel my boat, the old man at the dock gave me a concerned look. "You shouldn't go to that lake," he said, "and if you do, never use the forbidden bait." I shook my head, laughing inwardly. Superstitions, I thought, but there was something in his tone that unsettled me. He seemed to know something I didn't. Regardless, I decided not to listen. I was there to catch the biggest fish of my life, and nothing, no one, would stop me. I arrived at the lake near the end of the afternoon. The place was even darker than I had imagined. The water was black as pitch, the air heavy, and the silence was absolute. But that didn't shake me. I prepared the line, placing the forbidden bait on it, and cast it into the lake with my usual confidence. As the bait sank into the depths, I mentally prepared for the battle to come. I didn't know it yet, but that would be the last time I would feel so sure of myself on my boat. The waiting had always been my favorite part. That calm, the anticipation that at any moment something big could happen. However, that afternoon, the calm felt different. There was something in the air, as if the lake was waiting along with me. But I didn't give it much thought. The important thing was to stay focused. Time passed, and the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. I was starting to lose my patience. Nothing. No bite, no movement on the line. But then, just as I was considering reeling in and trying another spot, I felt a sudden tug. The rod nearly jumped out of my hands, and my whole body reacted instantly. The pull was so strong it felt like it wanted to tear my arm off. "Now we're talking," I thought, a grin forming on my face. This was what I had been waiting for. I gripped the rod tightly and started reeling in, certain that I had hooked the biggest fish in the lake. The strength of whatever was on the end of the line was unlike anything I had ever faced. It was monstrous. The boat rocked, slowly being dragged toward the center of the lake. I pulled with all my strength, but the creature wouldn't budge. It was as if it was in control, dragging me wherever it wanted. I tried to stay calm, but something didn't feel right. The way the boat moved, the way the line trembled, it was different. It was as if I wasn't dealing with a fish, but with something bigger, something that seemed more aware. For a brief moment, doubt crossed my mind. The old fisherman had said the bait wouldn't bring just any fish, but I was already too committed. The fight had only just begun, and I had no intention of giving up. As I continued to struggle with whatever was on the other end of the line, I noticed something else changing. The air around me, once calm and heavy, suddenly grew colder. Much colder. The kind of cold that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, like someone had just whispered in your ear. I looked around and noticed a thin mist starting to form on the lake's surface, making the scene even stranger and more terrifying. The boat started to be dragged more forcefully. The line seemed to pull my boat further and further into the lake's center, and panic began to creep into my mind. This isn't normal, I thought. No matter how big the fish, none should have enough strength to control a boat like that. I tried to turn the situation around, pulling on the line. But the creature seemed to have its own plan, one that didn't involve being caught. I started hearing strange sounds. At first, I thought it was the wind, but soon I realized the noises were coming from beneath the water, distant echoes, almost like muffled voices. The sound reverberated, heightening the sense that something was very wrong. The mist around the boat grew thicker, and visibility decreased. Now, I couldn't even see the shore. The silence, which I had once loved so much, became oppressive. All I could hear was my own heavy breathing and the strange sound of something moving in the depths. The weight on the line, once so intense, seemed to grow heavier by the second. It was then that I realized the entire lake was changing. It was no longer just a simple lake. It was as if it were alive, responding to what I had done. And in that moment, I began to question whether it had been wise to ignore the warnings. My breathing grew heavy, and every time I looked at the water, I felt the weight of the unknown closing in on me. I struggled with the rod, trying to regain control of the line, but it seemed futile. It was as if the force below was growing stronger with each passing second, as if it was toying with my frustration. Then something began to emerge. At first, I could only see a dark shape beneath the surface, something much larger than any fish I had ever hooked. My eyes widened and my entire body tensed. The thing, whatever it was, seemed to be slowly rising, revealing itself inch by inch. I pulled on the line with all my strength, but I felt that I was no longer in control of anything. When the creature finally emerged, I had to fight the urge to drop the rod and run to the corner of the boat. What I saw before me was indescribable. Covered in slime and uneven scales, the creature looked like it had come straight out of a nightmare. Its eyes, empty and fixed, didn't blink. They seemed to stare directly at me, as if it knew I was there because of my arrogance. Its mouth, filled with deformed teeth, slowly opened, and a deep guttural sound echoed from the depths of its body. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't a normal creature. It was something much older, much more dangerous, as if the lake itself had given life to it. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. A chill ran down my spine, and for the first time in many years I felt real fear. This wasn't the kind of fear that comes with the possibility of losing a battle against a big fish. It was the kind of fear that told me I had awakened something that should never have been disturbed. In that moment, I realized that I wasn't the hunter. I was the prey, and the thing in the lake was just beginning to reveal itself. The boat rocked violently, and I knew I had to act quickly. The creature before me, that thing I had brought up from the depths, seemed to be toying with my helplessness. Its empty eyes stared at me, and the terror became a physical presence, tightening around my chest. I wanted to believe that I could still escape, that I was still in control, but the reality was that I was on the verge of losing everything. I tried to cut the line. I grabbed my knife and began sawing at the thread with all my might, but it felt as though the lake itself wouldn't allow it. The creature writhed, pulling the boat further and further into the depths. Water started to fill the boat, and I felt desperation rise. My mind raced, searching for any solution, but there was only one. I had to leave everything behind. The forbidden bait was a trap, not for the creature, but for me. Now I could see it clearly. The old fisherman had warned me, and I ignored him, thinking I knew better. The price for that bait wasn't just catching a monstrous fish. It was my own life. It was my pride that I had to sacrifice to survive. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, I dropped the rod, let go of the gear, and prepared to abandon everything. If I wanted to live, I had to accept defeat. I had to let go of what was most precious to me, my prestige, my skill, my reputation, and let it sink with the creature. The water was already up to my feet, and the boat was tipping dangerously. I knew that if I didn't act now, there would be no turning back. And so, I let everything go, my pride along with the weight of the rod, and jumped out of the boat, swimming as fast as I could toward the shore. The cold of the water was like a shock of reality. Every stroke felt like an eternity, and I could still feel the weight of the creature pulling at me as if it were trying to drag me back down. The lake seemed alive, its black surface swirling around me, every movement making my escape harder. The water was dense, almost as if trying to trap me, and the sound of something moving just below me increased my panic. I swam with every ounce of strength I had left. My whole body was trembling, not just from the cold, but from the fear. The shore seemed far away, and the sound of the creature grew closer. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I'd give up right there. When I finally reached the shore, my hands found the cold, muddy ground, and I dragged myself out of the water, groaning with exhaustion. I lay on my back, my chest rising and falling rapidly, trying to catch my breath. My clothes were soaked, heavy, and the biting wind made me shiver even more. But I was alive. The lake, once so calm, was now silent again. The waves that had rocked the boat were gone, and the water returned to a macabre stillness. I looked back at the lake that had almost taken my life. Nothing moved. The creature had disappeared, as if it had never existed. I sat up slowly, my body still aching from the struggle and the escape. Everything I had, my boat, my rod, my reputation, was now lost at the bottom of that lake. But I was alive, and that was what mattered most. I would never return. I would never dare to challenge what shouldn't be challenged again. I stood up, still trembling, and turned my back on the black, treacherous lake, swearing that I would never come back. I have always been a simple man. My routine was peaceful, and the lake, isolated in the middle of a dense forest, was my refuge. Every time I felt the weight of responsibilities or the stress of daily life, I knew that a day of fishing would bring me the peace I needed. There it was just me, the water, and the sound of the wind. There was no rush, no noise from the city. Fishing was my way of escaping and recharging my energy. That day, everything seemed the same. The morning was cloudy, and a light breeze blew, gently rippling the surface of the lake. I had been there for a few hours, patiently waiting for something to bite my bait. It was one of those calm days when tranquility seemed to touch the air. Then something heavy got caught on the line. At first, I thought I had hooked a big fish, maybe the biggest of the season. My heart raced with anticipation as I struggled to pull up whatever was caught, but when I finally managed to bring it to the surface, it wasn't a fish. It was a bag, dirty, soaked, and old. The fabric was worn, as if it had been underwater for years. My first thought was to throw it back into the water. Trash, I thought. However, something inside me stopped me from doing that. There was a strange curiosity. Why was that bag there? What was inside? I set the bag on the boat and carefully undid the knot that kept it closed. A strong smell of moisture and something rotten immediately rose. My stomach turned pow, but I continued. Inside, I found several old letters stained with dried blood. There was also a small, rusted wedding ring and a statue of a human figure, its face distorted with pain. A sense of unease suddenly took hold of me. I looked around as if expecting to see someone watching me, but there was nothing but the silence of the lake. I grabbed the bag and its contents, deciding to take them home, not knowing that this moment would change my life forever. I returned home that afternoon with a feeling I couldn't explain. Something about that bag, those blood-stained letters, and the rusted ring made me uneasy. But I ignored the discomfort, placing the bag in a corner of the living room while trying to continue with my routine. The lake had always been a place of peace for me, and I wouldn't let an old bag ruin that. Night fell quickly. The house, located near the forest, was surrounded by the deep silence that I had always appreciated, but that night, the silence felt more oppressive. I lay in bed, hearing only the gentle sound of the wind in the trees. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but soon I started hearing something different. It was a faint sound, almost imperceptible at first. I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. As I focused more, the sound became clearer. It sounded like voices, or rather wails, a murmur of pain that slowly grew louder. I got out of bed, my heart racing, trying to pinpoint the origin of the sound. I looked out the window, expecting to see someone outside, but everything was deserted. I walked through the house, each step echoing on the wooden floor. Then I realized the sound was coming from the living room, from the corner where I had left the bag. The unease I had felt earlier now turned into fear. I approached slowly, and as I got closer, the wails seemed to intensify. They were distant voices, laden with suffering. I stopped in front of the bag, Unsure of what to do, instinct told me to throw it away immediately, but I hesitated. Something was holding me back. As if that discovery had somehow bound me, I tried to calm my mind. Maybe I'm imagining things, I thought. But when I turned to head back to the bedroom, I heard a whisper, clear as day. My name. It was no longer the wind, no longer murmurs. It was real. Someone or something was calling me. Now, what I had unearthed from that lake was beginning to show its true nature. The next morning, exhaustion weighed on me like never before. I had barely slept. The sound of the wails seemed to have echoed throughout the night, filling the house like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I looked at the bag in the corner of the living room, still with that unsettling feeling in my stomach. Something was very wrong. I decided I needed to get rid of it. I grabbed the bag with the blood-stained letters, the rusted ring, and the statue with its tortured face, determined to throw it far away. I walked to the edge of the forest and threw it as far as I could. For a moment I felt relief, as if I had shed a heavy burden. However, when I returned home, a terrible premonition overcame me. As I entered the living room, the air felt colder, heavier, and there, in the same corner where I had left it before, was the bag, intact, as if I had never removed it. Fear consumed me at that moment. My heart raced, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I ran out of the house, searching for a safe place, trying to rationalize what was happening. But there was no logical explanation. The bag was bound to me somehow, and no matter what I did, it always returned. In the following days, the voices grew louder, the wails more intense. The air in my house felt thicker, as if something dark was taking over everything. The shadows on the walls began to move, and I could swear that at night I saw humanoid shapes lurking in the corners of the house. My sanity was unraveling. What had once been a peaceful refuge in the middle of the forest had now become a haunted prison. I began to avoid the bag, trying not to look at it. But every time I passed through the living room, I felt like it was calling to me. I knew I needed to understand what was in that bag in order to free myself, but the fear of facing what I had uncovered was consuming me. Now it was no longer just curiosity. Something much deeper and older was tied to those letters and that ring. I was caught in a curse, and I didn't know how to escape. Despair took hold of me. There was no longer any way to ignore the wails, the shadows, the constant presence of that cursed bag. I knew I had to do something before it completely destroyed me. Returning to the lake seemed like the only solution. Perhaps, by returning the bag to the place it came from, I could end this curse. With the bag under my arm, I headed towards the lake. But this time the path felt different. The forest was denser. The twisted trees seemed as though they were trying to stop me from moving forward. The wind, once gentle, now carried whispers filled with suffering. It was as if the lake itself was waiting for me, aware of what I had done. As I reached the shore, I felt the weight of the bag increase in my hands. The voices were louder, almost screaming. When I opened the bag to look inside once again, something inside me churned. The letters, once only stained with blood, now had legible words, messages of despair and pain. The ring, once rusted, shone with a sinister gleam as if it were alive. At the bottom of the bag, the statue with the tortured face looked more grotesque than ever, its expression of suffering now almost real. And then I understood. Those letters were cries for help, messages from people who had been betrayed, forgotten, and abandoned. The ring was a symbol of broken bonds. The bag was a tomb, and I had brought back the suffering of those souls. I tried to throw the bag back into the lake, but something pulled me. It was as if the waters wanted to swallow me along with the bag. The shadows moved around me, taking shape, whispering my name. I felt invisible hands grabbing my arms, trying to drag me into the lake. Panic overwhelmed me, and I fought with all my strength, trying to resist. The voices were deafening. The weight of the past, of those lost souls, seemed to take root in me. It was as if I was the next to be dragged into that same fate of oblivion and pain. In that moment of pure despair, something inside me broke. I felt my strength waning, and the voices that had once been wails were now screaming, crying out for justice, for vengeance. The shadows surrounding me were closer, almost touching my skin. I knew that if I didn't act quickly, I would be dragged to the bottom of that lake, just like the souls trapped there. With trembling hands, I grabbed the rusted ring and the blood-stained letters. The grotesque statue still stared at me with its expression of eternal pain. I remembered the words from the letters I had managed to read. Fragments of pleas for forgiveness, of hopelessness. It was as if those souls had been betrayed by those they loved, abandoned in suffering. And now I understood what I had to do. I took the ring to the water's surface, where the gentle waves lapped at the shore. I whispered a prayer that I made up in the moment, asking for the souls to find peace, to be freed from this curse. I threw the ring into the water, and the surface, once agitated, began to calm. The shadows around me hesitated. The weight of the bag seemed to lessen in my hands. Summoning courage, I released the letters into the wind, letting the air carry them away. The voices began to dissipate, and the air around me grew lighter. The dark forms that had surrounded me slowly started to disappear, as if they had finally received what they had long wanted. At last, with my heart still racing, I looked at the statue that had tormented me. In one final gesture, I threw it into the lake. The sound of it sinking into the water echoed in my mind, like the end of a cycle. I felt the presence of the souls fade, the voices disappearing completely. Everything became silent. Exhausted, I sat by the lake, gazing at the waters that now seemed serene. I had survived, but I knew I would never be the same. The weight of what had happened still hung over me, and although the souls had found rest, I would never forget the wails that echoed through the dark nights. I would never return to that lake, but the memories, those would haunt me forever. Fishing had always been my escape. Growing up in a small town, surrounded by forests and rivers, I found peace in the quiet of nature. Life had its stresses, work, family obligations, but when I was out on the water with a fishing rod in hand, everything else disappeared. It became a ritual for me, something I shared with my best friend, Eric. We had been fishing together for as long as I could remember, and every year we'd pick a new spot to explore. That weekend was supposed to be just like any other trip. We had chosen a secluded river far off the beaten path, where we could spend a couple of days away from everything and everyone. The drive took longer than expected, winding through dense woods. But when we finally arrived, the sight of the river flowing peacefully made it all worth it. The place was perfect, untouched, serene. The trees cast long shadows over the water as the sun began to set. We set up camp on a small clearing by the riverbank, talking about the big fish we hoped to catch. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the gentle flow of the river. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. After setting up the tent and preparing our gear, we sat by the water, casting our lines and waiting in comfortable silence. As night crept in, we built a fire, laughing about old stories and enjoying the simplicity of the moment. Little did we know, this trip would be anything but simple. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Eric was already outside the tent, boiling water for coffee. I stretched, feeling the cool morning air hit my face as I stepped out. "Sleep well?" Eric asked, passing me a steaming cup. "Like a rock," I replied. The night had been calm, just the kind of peaceful escape we'd both been looking for. As we sipped our coffee, I noticed something odd on the ground near the tent. There were footprints, large, deep prints, circling around our campsite. My first instinct was to laugh it off, thinking Eric had gone for a midnight walk. "Did you walk around last night?" I asked. Eric glanced over, his face dropping as he saw the footprints. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I didn't leave the tent after we went to bed." We both crouched down, examining the prints. They were unmistakably human, but far too large and deep for either of us. The ground around the campsite was still damp from the previous night, so the prints stood out clearly, leading in a circle around our tent before disappearing into the trees. A chill ran down my spine. We were miles away from any other campsite or town. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. Eric and I exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of us said what we were both thinking. Who or what had been walking around us while we slept? The rest of the day passed in a strange tension. We tried to shake off the uneasiness, telling ourselves it was probably just a passing hiker or some kind of animal. Still, neither of us could fully relax. Every sound in the forest seemed sharper, every rustle of the leaves more significant. By the time the sun began to set, we hadn't caught a single fish, and both of us were on edge. Maybe we should keep watch tonight, Eric suggested as we packed up our fishing gear, just to be safe. I nodded, trying to hide the fact that the idea actually gave me some relief. The thought of going to sleep again, not knowing if someone or something might be watching us, was unsettling. So we decided to take turns keeping watch, starting with Eric. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, I lay down in the tent, struggling to fall asleep. The forest was eerily quiet, almost unnaturally so. The usual sounds of insects and night creatures were missing, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. It wasn't long before I heard it. A soft, distant sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind in the trees, but as I focused, I realized it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere beyond the firelight. "Eric," I whispered, sitting up. He didn't respond. I peeked out of the tent and saw him standing by the fire, frozen in place, his eyes scanning the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see what was out there. But there was nothing, only the sound of something unseen moving around us. We were not alone. The footsteps eventually faded into the night, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. Eric and I stayed awake for hours, watching the darkness, our senses heightened by fear. Neither of us said much, but the weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, we were both exhausted and uneasy. "I didn't sleep at all," Eric muttered as he poked at the dying embers of the fire. "Me neither," I admitted, "but at least it's morning now." We decided to walk around the camp before breakfast, just to ease our nerves. That's when we saw it. More footprints, larger this time and closer. They weren't just circling the campsite like the day before. These prints led directly to our tents, stopping only a few feet from where we had been sleeping. A shiver ran down my spine. Whoever or whatever had been out there last night had gotten much closer than we realized. Eric crouched down, tracing one of the prints with his hand. "These weren't here yesterday," he said, his voice tight. "We would have noticed," I nodded, my mind racing. The size of the prints was unnerving, far too big for any normal person, and the fact that they'd appeared while we were awake, listening, only made it worse. We had heard the footsteps, but we hadn't seen a thing. "We need to leave," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric looked at me, eyes wide with fear, and nodded in agreement. We hurriedly packed up our gear, casting anxious glances into the surrounding trees, feeling watched the entire time. Whatever was out there had no intention of letting us leave in peace. With our gear hastily packed, we made our way to the car. The morning sun, which usually brought a sense of safety, did little to ease the tension that clung to the air. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, anything following us. Eric walked in silence beside me, his pace quickening as we neared the clearing where we had parked. But when we reached the car, the unease only deepened. There, on the ground around the vehicle, were more footprints. They were the same massive, human-like tracks we had seen by the tent, only this time they were fresher. They circled the car and led back towards the river, disappearing into the brush. "How?" Eric's voice was barely audible as he stared at the prints. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what we were seeing. We had been awake. We hadn't heard anyone approach. No rustling in the leaves, no movement, nothing. Yet the evidence was right there in the dirt, as though something had been watching us the entire time. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. We needed to leave, and fast. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the doors. "We're getting out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Eric nodded, wide-eyed, and we threw our gear into the trunk. As we got into the car, I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road without a second glance back at the river. But as we drove away, the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had left those footprints wasn't done with us yet. As we sped down the narrow, winding road away from the river, the tension in the car was palpable. Neither Eric nor I spoke, but the silence between us was filled with unspoken fear. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I could hear Eric's shaky breathing beside me. Every now and then, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, some figure, some shadow, standing in the road behind us. And then, I did. For a split second, I saw it. A dark figure, tall and unmoving, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. My heart skipped a beat, and I blinked, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric turned his head, his eyes wide. "See what?" I hesitated, unsure of what I'd actually seen. I thought I saw something." We didn't talk much after that. The road stretched on, the trees on either side blurring as I pushed the car faster. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to focus, but that image, the figure standing in the woods, stayed with me, burned into my mind. Even as the distance between us and the river grew, the sense of unease didn't fade. It was as if whatever had been watching us back there had followed us, silently, unseen. We didn't stop driving until we reached the outskirts of the nearest town, hours later. The fear that had gripped us at the river still clung to my skin, like a cold sweat that wouldn't go away. Eric and I barely exchanged words. We both knew there wasn't much to say. When we finally pulled over at a gas station, I stepped out of the car, my legs trembling as I stretched. Eric stayed inside, staring blankly out the window, his mind clearly still trapped back at the river. The normalcy of the town, the buzzing neon lights, the sound of distant traffic, felt surreal, as though we had crossed back into reality after escaping something otherworldly. But even here, far from the river, the feeling of being watched lingered. We checked into a small roadside motel, but I barely slept that night. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of wind outside the window sent a jolt of fear through me. The image of those massive footprints circling our camp and the figure I thought I saw in the woods haunted my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. The next morning, Eric and I sat in silence over coffee. Neither of us mentioned going back to the river. We both knew we wouldn't. Whatever we had encountered there, whatever had been watching us, was something we couldn't explain and something we didn't want to face again. We packed up and left town shortly after. Eric went back to the city, and I moved to another town entirely, far from any rivers, lakes, or forests. But no matter how far I go, no matter how much I try to forget, the memories of that weekend and the sensation of being watched will never truly leave me. Fishing has always been my life. I've spent more time on the sea than on land, and over the years I've learned to embrace the solitude it brings. There's something calming about the endless horizon, the rhythmic crash of waves, and the silent patience it demands. But that night everything was different. A violent storm had rolled in, far more brutal than I anticipated. The winds howled, and the waves battered my boat, threatening to capsize it. In the midst of the chaos, I spotted it, a small desolate island with a towering lighthouse. The beacon was still lit, though I knew that no one had manned this lighthouse in decades. Desperate for shelter, I steered my boat towards the rocky shore. As I docked and stepped onto the island, I immediately felt a chill run down my spine. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the island had been waiting for me. The lighthouse loomed overhead, casting an eerie glow that penetrated the fog. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Yet, I had no choice. I had to seek refuge inside. The lighthouse door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a damp, musty smell hit me immediately. Inside, It was just as abandoned as I had expected. Dust thickly coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners like forgotten memories. The walls were peeling, the floorboards creaked with each step, and the air felt colder than outside. But what unsettled me the most was the light at the top, still glowing steadily. No one should have been here in years, yet the beacon shone as if it had been tended to daily. I scanned the room, searching for any signs of recent human activity, but there were none. Just silence, as if the place had been frozen in time. I spotted an old wooden desk in the corner, with papers strewn across it, yellowed and brittle from age. Curious, I picked up one of the pages. It was a journal, written by the lighthouse keeper, dated more than 30 years ago. As I skimmed the entries, one word kept repeating: trapped. A cold sweat broke out on my neck. What had the keeper meant? And why had he suddenly stopped writing? The light flickered for the briefest moment, and I froze. Something was watching. I stood frozen, gripping the old journal in my hand, trying to convince myself that it was just the storm causing the flickering light. But deep down, I knew better. The air felt heavier, oppressive even, and the silence inside the lighthouse wasn't the comforting kind I had known out on the open sea. It was the kind that pressed down on you, like a weight you couldn't shake. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from above. My breath caught in my throat. Someone or something was moving upstairs. I strained my ears, hoping I was imagining it, but the creaking floorboards were unmistakable. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing just beyond my sight. I glanced at the stairwell leading to the top of the lighthouse. Every instinct told me to leave, to turn back and get out of there. But my curiosity, or maybe my arrogance, got the better of me. I grabbed the lantern on the table and started my ascent. Each step felt like an eternity. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight, and the temperature seemed to drop with every step I took. By the time I reached the top, the footsteps had stopped. I pushed open the door to the lantern room, and there, scratched into the floor, were deep, jagged marks, like something had clawed its way across the wood. The sight of the claw marks sent a chill down my spine. I knelt down to inspect them, running my fingers lightly over the deep grooves. They were old, but there was no mistaking their origin. These were no ordinary scratches. Something with great strength and desperation had left its mark here. I looked up toward the glowing beacon above. It hummed softly, casting long shadows around the room. In the center of the lantern room, I found another journal, this one much older than the first. I flipped through its brittle pages. The ink faded, but still legible. It wasn't long before I found the final, haunting entries. The lighthouse keeper hadn't just disappeared. He had been consumed by the very light he tended. According to his writings, the light wasn't just a guide for lost ships. It was a trap. The light lured souls, just as it had lured me. And once they were close enough, they were drawn in, never to escape. A sudden gust of wind howled through the open windows, and I felt the floor beneath me tremble slightly. The scratches on the ground, the frantic journal entries, it all began to make sense. The lighthouse wasn't a refuge, it was a prison, and it wanted me next. Panic surged through me as the reality of the situation sank in. I was trapped in a place that had claimed others before me. The lighthouse had been waiting for someone like me, someone foolish enough to enter. The walls seemed to close in, and the hum of the light above grew louder, as if it was calling me, pulling me closer. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. Without thinking, I grabbed the lantern and ran back down the spiraling stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls groaned as if they were alive, as if they were urging me to return to the light. But I pushed forward, ignoring the weight of the unseen presence that seemed to follow me. When I finally reached the bottom, the door slammed shut behind me, and the air outside hit me like a shock. The storm had calmed, but the island still felt suffocating. I rushed toward my boat, half expecting the lighthouse to pull me back before I could escape. As I pushed off the shore, I dared one last glance at the lighthouse. For a moment, I saw a figure at the top, standing where I had been. It was watching me, holding the same journal I had found. I never returned to that island, but sometimes, when I'm out at sea, I still feel the pull of the light in the distance, as if it's waiting for me to come back. Fishing has always been my way to escape from the routine, the solitude of the sea, the calm sound of waves lapping against the boat, and the timelessness between casting and waiting. I had fished in many places over the years, but that day I decided to explore a remote area, a stretch of sea where few dared to go. People said the waters were treacherous there, but that never scared me. To me, danger was just part of the adventure. The morning was quiet, the sun was barely over the horizon, and I was already anchored in my fishing spot. The air was still, quieter than usual, as if the whole world had decided to pause. I cast my line with the patience of someone who's done it 1,000 times. I knew it would take time for something to bite, and that was part of what I loved about fishing. The waiting, the anticipation. Hours passed slowly. The sky, once clear, started to cloud over, but nothing that indicated a storm. It was just one of those days when the sea felt heavier, and that's when I felt the first tug on the line. It wasn't just any tug, it was strong, sudden, as if something really big was on the other end. My heart raced a bit, but this was exactly what I'd been hoping for. Maybe I had caught something special, the kind of fish every fisherman dreams of telling others about. I began to reel it in with all my strength, fighting against the resistance. The weight was different, heavier than anything I had felt before. My arms were aching by the time the thing finally started to surface, and what I saw left me speechless. As the creature broke the surface, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't like any fish I had ever seen before. Its scales glistened with an eerie sheen, shimmering in shades of dark green and silver, almost too bright for the overcast sky. But it wasn't the color that disturbed me. It was the eyes, large, round, and disturbingly human-like, staring at me as if it could see right into my soul. I stood there, frozen for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. The fish wriggled violently, thrashing against the side of the boat, but it made no sound, not a single splash from the water as it struggled. The silence around me grew thick, oppressive, like the world had stopped to observe this bizarre catch. My heart raced, and a strange, creeping unease started to spread through my chest. For a second, I thought about letting it go. Something about this creature wasn't right, and every instinct in me screamed to cut the line and leave it in the depths where it belonged. But the thrill of the catch, the need to prove I could land this unknown beast, overrode my fear. I grabbed my net and hauled it onto the boat. The fish flopped onto the deck with a heavy thud, its body twitching unnaturally as if it was still alive, but somehow not. Its eyes remained locked on me the entire time, unblinking, unnerving. A chill ran down my spine. I had fished all my life, caught creatures big and small, familiar and strange, but nothing like this. My hands shook slightly as I secured the fish, a mixture of excitement and fear coursing through me. I told myself it was just an ordinary catch, albeit a strange one. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had captured something far beyond the ordinary, and I had no idea what to do with it. The further I sailed back toward the shore, the stranger things became. The fish, still alive despite being out of water, lay on the deck, twitching in slow, deliberate movements. Every so often, its human-like eyes would shift, following my every step, as if it were studying me. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the one in control of this situation anymore. I had planned to head back earlier, but now there was something about the air that felt off. The wind picked up, sharp and cold, and the clouds thickened above me. The once calm sea began to churn, waves gently rocking the boat more forcefully than before. My gut twisted with a sense of impending doom. I looked at the fish again, trying to ignore the mounting dread gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. It was still alive, unnaturally so. The longer I stared at it, the more I swore I could hear something. A whisper, faint at first, like it was coming from far beneath the surface. My breath caught. I glanced around the boat, searching for the source of the noise, But there was no one. Just me, the boat, and the fish. The whispers grew louder, clearer. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the sea. They seemed to be coming from the fish itself. No, it can't be, I muttered, shaking my head, trying to dismiss the idea. But as the whispers grew into something almost tangible, like words spoken just out of reach, my hands gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white. I turned to the fish, horrified by the thought that was forming in my mind. Was this thing trying to communicate with me? My heart raced, the boat lurched, and for a brief moment, the water around me churned violently as though something enormous had moved just beneath the surface. The sky darkened, and in that moment, I knew this was no ordinary fish. I had pulled something ancient from the deep, something that should have stayed there. The boat rocked violently again, almost knocking me off my feet. The sky above had turned an unnatural shade of dark grey, almost black, and the waves around me swelled, pushing the boat in unpredictable directions. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back toward the fish, unable to tear my eyes away from its eerie, unblinking gaze. The whispers, they were no longer whispers. They were clear now, though I couldn't make out the language. It was an ancient tongue, guttural and strange, yet somehow familiar. It echoed inside my mind, louder and louder, like it was burrowing deep into my thoughts, pulling me into some kind of trance. I could feel something pressing on my consciousness, something vast and incomprehensible. I wanted to throw the fish back. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to toss it overboard, to let it sink back into the abyss from where it had come. But something stopped me, something stronger than fear, something I couldn't explain. My hands moved toward the fish as if drawn by an unseen force, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. And then, as I touched its cold, slimy skin, the world around me shifted. In an instant, everything fell silent. The storm ceased. The waves stopped. The air was still. I stood frozen, my hand still on the fish, my mind swirling with confusion. The fish's eyes glowed faintly, and for a brief moment I saw something. A flash of a world beneath the ocean, ancient and dark, a place where things far older than humanity dwelled. A deep, primal fear seized me. I yanked my hand back, gasping for air as if I had been drowning. The boat jerked, and suddenly the fish let out a long, low groan, a sound that made my blood run cold. Without thinking, I grabbed the fish and hurled it overboard. It hit the water with a splash, sinking immediately into the depths. The whispers stopped. The storm lifted. The sea became calm again. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where the fish had vanished. My mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The ancient dark knowledge I had glimpsed in that brief moment haunted me, and I knew I had come far too close to something I should have never disturbed. I sat down on the edge of the boat, my entire body trembling. The sea around me was unnaturally calm now, almost as if the storm had never happened. The sky began to clear, but I couldn't shake the sense of dread that lingered inside me. I stared at the water, expecting the fish to resurface, to pull me back into that nightmare, but it didn't. For a moment, I let out a sigh of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had rid myself of whatever curse or dark presence I had accidentally awoken. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The images I had seen, the glimpses of an ancient, submerged world, the feeling of something far older and more powerful than I could understand, they wouldn't leave my mind. I started the engine and headed back to shore. Every minute felt like an eternity, with the weight of what had happened pressing down on me. I didn't know how I would explain any of this to anyone who would believe me. A fisherman pulling an ancient creature from the sea, one that whispered strange words and showed him visions of a forgotten world. No, this wasn't a story I could ever tell. As the boat cut through the now calm waters, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that fish again, its unblinking eyes watching me from the surface. But the sea remained empty. When I finally reached the shore, I jumped off the boat and tied it up, my hands still shaking. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I threw my gear into the truck, slammed the door shut, and drove away, leaving the sea behind me. But as I drove, I realized something terrifying. It wasn't just the sea I was leaving. It was a part of myself too. The part that had always found solace and peace in the water. The part of me that had loved fishing more than anything. Now the water was only a reminder of what I had seen, of the ancient, unknowable horrors that lurked beneath the surface. I haven't returned to the sea since. I moved to a small inland town, far from the coast, far from any body of water large enough to hold whatever I had encountered. I try to live a quiet life, pretending that what happened out there was just a bad dream. But every now and then, in the dead of night, I hear those whispers again. And I know that, no matter how far I go, the sea will never truly let me go. If you liked it, comment below, like and subscribe.